What is the natural human response to information overload? We're constantly bombarded through the media, and the only response that really makes sense is pattern recognition. You have to find patterns that make sense out of all the data that's being thrown at you. You can't sort of put together these tiny, intricate, linear sequences of causality anymore because there's too much information to deal with. So we step back from it all, and Impressionism may have been the enunciation of this, the sort of stepping back from the image to see the whole pattern, and then you get this whole full thing rather than focusing on the, if you look at the dots in Impressionism, you can't see anything. So that may have been the early enunciation of what now is taking place in our culture. And so Hillman is just part of this movement of shifting from concepts to mythic images. For example, he'll look at Freud's system. He'll say, what's going on in Freud? What is the id, after all? What is the ego? And he'll say, well, the ego is really the hero, and the id is really the underworld, and the whole thing is the myth of the hero's descent into the underworld and his attempt to conquer and control and slay dragons, and in particular, the myth of Hercules, where Hercules storms into the underworld and he just takes what he wants and then leaves. It's a very masculinist, control-oriented mythology, but it is a myth. So he goes through and sort of uncovers the concepts and shows you what the myths are underneath them. And so this is what Hillman's up to. Yes?
Also looking at the system of astrology, as we move from one age to another, out of necessity changes take place.
Yes.
And the symbols are changing. The age of Pisces is the Christian, and as we shift into Aquarius, it's about information.
Right.
So,
and the environment is more conducive to astrology now, I think. Yeah. It's more acceptable.
If you look at the ages, we look at the industrial revolution, which creates the need for change. It's evolutionary in nature, and look at the cycles and look back at past the prior cycles and see, what evolved from ages.
Right. Whole systems thinking. Yeah. So this kind of holism is the zeitgeist.
And it's sort of a spiral cycle.
Yes. So then, moving directly then into Hillman, I just want to recapitulate, go back over briefly. You recall that I did this last time, but it's worth recapitulating. Right. Freud, you'll remember, invented psychoanalysis, and he entered into, really sort of invented the discipline of psychology, taking it out of medicine, and he really considered it a science because of the medical background. But his primary study was hysteria, and hysteria is a neurosis. Whereas Jung came to all of this, and he reverses the terms, and he has his analytical psychology, but both suggest the presence of the analytical mind is still very strong here. The analysis of the psyche is still very strong with both men. And Jung entered into this to the study of schizophrenia, which is not a neurosis but a psychosis. And so Jung arrived at his system of psychology through living in an asylum for like 10 years, the Bergelsey Mental Hospital, and dealing with psychotic patients, people who had withdrawn from reality to such a degree that they were essentially mythologizing and creating their own interior mythologies and could not relate to so-called consensus reality, whereas Freud was really studying neurotic individuals, people who were generally functional, people who could discern between reality and non-reality, except in certain areas, certain sensitive areas in their lives. There would be these neuroses. And so we have the psychoanalysis, analytical psychology, and remember with Stanislav Grof last time we have transpersonal psychology, where for Grof the whole thing now is the contact with the numinous, with the great Neptunian spiritual energies that the mind is sort of holographically repressing, and the mind is like this restrictor valve which can be opened up either with LSD or with holotropic breath work. You can just slowly open up the valve and experience all kinds of different dimensions from different levels of reality, from everything to the astral plane to identification with plant or animal consciousness and all of that. So that's transpersonal psychology. Now, it's just important to define these terms in contradistinction to what Hillman is up to, because Hillman's whole system is really founded against all of this in many ways. He is entirely dependent on Jung. He is a Jungian, and he's almost unintelligible without some knowledge of the Jungian system. But so Hillman comes along, And his system is then called, actually there's no system to it, but it's called archetypal psychology. And he specifically wants to remove the mind from psychology, the rational, intellectual mind. At least that's his aim. And he enters into this from the study of depression and suicide in particular. Now, his first important book is the 1964 book Suicide and the Soul, and it is from that book that the whole soul movement that we are familiar with now in psychology originated. Thomas More in 1992 published The Care of the Soul, and it's as a result of that book being a bestseller that everyone is familiar with the word soul and why it's sort of in the general consciousness. And also the fact that, recall that Joseph Campbell had died in 1987, and then in the late 80s, 88, 89, his books, The Power of Myth and The Hero with a Thousand Faces, were on the New York Times bestseller list for that period of time. So that kind of paved the way for the popularity of The Care of the Soul and kind of opened up people to the whole Jungian world. Jung still isn't respectable as far as academia goes, but as far as the popular consciousness goes, Jung does quite well. And so The Care of the Soul came out, and when you read The Care of the Soul, it's not a bad book. It's certainly nowhere in the league with Hillman or any of these other men. Thomas More was a Catholic priest for many years and has lots of degrees and so forth. But the book is really about the relationship of mythology to the modern world, and people were ready to hear about that after the popularity of Campbell. So now we have this soul psychology as the direct result of Thomas More's work. And Thomas More's idea of soul really doesn't map on very well with Hillman's, despite the fact that Hillman is his mentor, and his entire work rests on a popularization of Hillman's ideas because, the whole thing is summed up sort of in the PBS interviews with Thomas More. I don't know if anybody caught them, sitting in a very expensive turtleneck sweater with a New England fireplace roasting behind him, and the whole sort of roasting chestnuts in the fire approach to soul, with going to a party and all your friends have made a lot of money, and that whole approach to soul is not what Hillman is talking about, with his emphasis on depression, failure, not success, failure, and inferiority. These are all enunciations of the soul to the ego, announcements that I'm here. That's it. The soul is here, and it is neglected. And so Hillman emphasizes pathologizing. We need to learn to read in our symptoms what myths and fantasies are coming up. These are simply neglected gods and beings which have been simply not taken into account by the waking consciousness and are announcing themselves through failure, through inhibition, through repression and suicide. So he says in the book Suicide and the Soul, suicide is really a kind of literalized fantasy of the need to undergo a death experience. What is really happening in suicide is people want, the soul needs to have an experience of death. It needs to undergo the death experience, not literally, but figuratively through a dying of consciousness. Now this is to be contrasted with Graf's idea that we discussed last time, that suicide is the attempt to undergo the birth trauma. You remember we said that you have the trauma of the birth process is what the suicidal person is really trying to re-experience, whereas for Hillman it's the death experience that the soul is trying to get to. Now, the two are interconnected because certainly birth and death are part of the same spectrum. But Graf emphasizes the birth aspect of suicide, and Hillman emphasizes the death aspect. And we tend to sterilize death out of our culture. We tend not to talk about it. We tend not to deal with it. And Hillman says what's going on in people with depression and suicide is that they need to have contact with it. Not actually physically to die, but they need to discuss the ideas and they need to deal with it. And it's something that should not be repressed and neglected and swept under the carpet and sterilized and hidden with words like, the person passed on. Death is a real thing, is something that should be dealt with, faced, and processed and moved on. So that's sort of, Hillman starts with Suicide and the Soul. And then his next major work is The Myth of Analysis, which is based on a series of Aronos lectures that he gave in 1966, 68, and 69. The Aronos lectures were still ongoing up through the 80s. And that book came out, and then that was followed by Revisioning Psychology in 1975, which, when